This is the final episode of a series chronicling what the Jets forwards might do next season, and now we are down to the mysterious and ever-fluid fourth line.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are concluding our forward series for season predictions next year. Obviously, I mentioned earlier this week, I am out this week, so we are doing some season predictions for our line-by-line skaters. And now you have arrived at the series finale with the fourth line. Perhaps the most interesting group of players, because this is where we have the most, in my mind, competition for roster spots. The Jets have brought in Koepke and, of course, Tanner Pearson, all of whom are going to be vying for some form of bottom six spot. And if we see, the kinds of wings that we have already in our system, it's going to be a bit of a dogfight for some of these guys to find actual ice time. So we're going to dive into three guys that I think have a pretty good inside shot at roster spots on this fourth line, and maybe talk a little bit about some of their competition as well. But before we dive into our first guy, Morgan Barron, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So, Morgan Barron. I talked about him the other day as a guy who is currently dealing with an RFA case. Obviously, the Jets are probably keen to extend him, although not for much, I would say. Morgan had a bit of a breakout season the prior year to this, and then this past season, I kind of feel took a bit of a step back. In 22-23 and 23-24, we saw him put up around 20-ish points for the Jets. This year he had 15, which is not bad, but I think what really stood out with Barron was that when he was playing as a wing this year, I didn't really get the sense that he was doing all the same defensive and offensive work that we saw previously. It felt like his reads were not as good, kind of felt like he wasn't really as engaged or creating as much effectively, and just kind of looked like a very okay fourth liner. And then they moved him to center late in the season, and it seemed like he really started to take off again. Suddenly, he was like a one-man army, sort of wrecking guys, kind of had a Yoel Armia sort of approach to crashing the crease, and it just looked a lot more effective. Then, the playoffs happened, and he sort of went back to being regular Morgan Barron, which is fine. But I do feel like there's just a version of this guy that we haven't really gotten consistent performances from. Like, I keep thinking that there's untapped potential with Barron, and then he'll have streaks of like 10 or so games where you're like, no, he kind of looks like a fourth liner, which is great. I think that there's a real spot for a player like this, and certainly I like Barron's overall approach, but I do feel like there are just limitations in this game that have sort of held him back from maybe being higher up in the lineup. So with Barron, I do kind of feel like we're looking at, a solid 15 to 20 point guy. I expect him to probably start at center, or either that or Namestnikov may get the look, but I think it's probably Barron. Namestnikov is better as a winger in my mind anyways, but once everyone's fully healthy, he'll probably slide back to wing. Now, Barron does have a little bit of competition, and it makes me wonder how likely it is that he's actually a Jet for the remainder of this upcoming season. We brought in Cole Koepke for a little, for just a year at a mill, not a lot. And Koepke kind of plays a not too dissimilar game. He's a high energy forward, bit of a forechecking sort of guy, hits a lot, and also had 17 points. In general, he does some decent defensive work, and I think you're seeing his first year with the Bruins looking pretty good. Koepke is the sort of player that you find waived a lot, but I think his overall game might compete with Barron's, and so that's kind of an interesting thing to look at potentially for camp. I think Koepke, of the guys that they've signed outside of like Nyquist, might have the better shot at starting over maybe like a Tanner Pearson. With Pearson, though, he does have the Mark Scheifele friendship factor, so maybe Koepke is more on the outside looking in, but the Jets do have some decisions to make with this bottom six. I feel like they're going to be carrying quite a few of these like bottom fourth line contracts, and so Barron may kind of be on the outs. And if the Jets make some sort of a trade for a roster player to upgrade the top six, maybe Barron gets packaged up and moved back the other way. All that said, though, I think Winnipeg generally likes him. I think the fan base is generally a pretty big fan of Barron. He's big. He skates pretty well. He's got a pretty good shot. It hasn't always reflected in some of his goal scoring outputs, but I don't know. I just feel like at some point he will put two and two together and become a pretty decent player. But I think a lot of it is very line mate dependent with him. He's got a lot of the raw tool sets, but I don't know if necessarily the decision making and stuff is always there. You can very much see when he has the puck in possession by himself and he's streaking in alone. He is fast, mobile, and he has one heck of a shot. You always see that skill there. You kind of know why the Rangers were reasonably intrigued by his game. But so far, it hasn't really coalesced into anything above like a bottom six role. So intrigued to see what he does this year. I do feel like at some point he gets shipped out for some sort of a roster upgrade. I can't explain why. It just has that sort of vibe. And given what Winnipeg brought in, I feel like there's more competition than ever for these fourth line spots. And now you've got, some of the kids really needing a shot at the team. And so a player like Barron, as much as he's a nice guy to have, not necessarily somebody that I think the team is like dying to keep. I'm sure they'd love to save some money, probably why they're going to arbitration here. They want to try and shave off a few $100,000 here and there. And it makes me wonder what Barron's ask actually was. So going to be a very interesting year for him. If he does stick around, though, again, I would probably put him in the 15 to 20 point category. Would really like to see him kind of bring back some of that goal scoring ability. He had a season where he was potting, 11 goals, which was really impressive. Not that 8's anything to sniff at, but I just feel like when I saw him in the 23-24 season, I felt like he was on the cusp of really breaking out and having a bigger role with the team. And last year, the step back just kind of felt a little bit disappointing for what my expectations were. So would love to see him have a big year in camp. I like him as a really nice depth option, and I think his best position really is down the middle. But we all kind of know how the Jets are. We know that they tend to play some of their centers out wide, and with Namestnikov likely having the seniority there, I'd expect Vlad or Taves, depending on what happens once Lowry's back, to be your 4C. So keep an eye out for that. But if Barron does stick around, I think he'll have a pretty solid season. Now, his line mate in Vlad Namestnikov is a very interesting one for a lot of reasons. You've heard me talk a lot about Vlad not really being a 2C for the Jets. If he does not play that role this coming season, I think it would make a lot of sense for the Jets to put him as like an elite fourth liner. But he is being paid a little bit of cash, maybe more than you would ordinarily pay your fourth liners. And I want to talk about what happens if he sees that reduction in ice time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Gametime comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, and even invite a bigger group to come with you. Gametime makes everything possible. And it makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. And they've got great last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. I've used Gametime when I was buying Ravens versus Chiefs tickets. It was awesome. And, for the baseball games, it's a great opportunity to get some really big discounts. As an Orioles fan, love saving some cash to watch Baltimore occasionally screw up here and there. But for a lot of you who are looking for some really big specials ahead of the Club World Cup and even the eventual 2026 World Cup, Gametime has last minute tickets and zone deals for big savings like 10% off exclusive zone deals for FIFA Club World Cup matchups. So be sure to check them out. They've got seat views right in the app before you buy, so you always go in knowing what you're paying for. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about the Jets' fourth line and what we might expect from this group as Winnipeg starts to see a lot of competition for some of these bottom of the roster spots. Now, I know it sounds very silly to talk about the fourth line competition, but I really do feel like this is where we have the potential to see some big changes, some big movement, and I think that there's real opportunity for some guys who are newcomers and maybe some of the more established veterans to try and vie for some real role playing, right? And one of those guys is Vlad Namestnikov. Now, Namestnikov the past year has been the Jets 2C and has played that role in the previous year. This season, I really feel like the Jets need to get away from that, right? Like the 2C Namestnikov thing just wasn't working out that well. Now, you'll look at his points production, 38 points this year, 37 the previous season, and ask, what am I talking about, right? Why wasn't he a good 2C? For one thing, Namestnikov doesn't really win face-offs, which I think a lot of people really put a lot of value on. I personally don't put as much emphasis on it, but it would be nice to win at least half of those if possible. And Namestnikov was putting out like 45 to 40% at times, so not exactly a big face-off guy. What you get with Vlad is a player who can generally keep up, but who doesn't have like a lot of high-end offense. Nemestnikov's biggest value is in the forecheck and doing some of the hard, gritty defensive work. When it comes to like wall battles and stuff, that's really where he'll do most of his damage. And it's not like he can't score, but I think if you're asking him to be a really big offensive play driver, that's not really Nemestnikov's game. As a supporting middle six to bottom six forward, I think he is fantastic in this role. But if you ask him to be a 2C guy, that's just not really what you want on a true contender. And I think the Jets kind of saw the limitations with him scoring only 11 goals per season and, kind of getting in that 25-ish point range. If you play him where you really should, which is more on your fourth line in very limited minutes, I would expect him to get around the 20-ish point range. I think if you flex him out to the wing position rather than the 4C position, I think it would also suit his game a little more. I think when he's the sort of bang and crash guy along the walls, that's great. I think that's where he does so much of his best work. As a center in the fourth line spot, again, I don't think it would be bad, and I think it would be probably one of the better fourth line centers the Jets have had over the past couple of years. He has the veteran savvy and experience to know what he can do and can't do and get away with, but he also brings that two-way maturity and presence that, really can fortify your bottom line. And it also gives the Jets some flexibility to potentially use their fourth line more than they have in the past. If you have a situation where you've got like 1-2-2, maybe 3 configuration with your time on ice deployments, I feel like that could work out reasonably favorably. And again, I say that 1-2-2-3 not being like really hard cutoffs here, but just sort of in terms of priority and importance, having that 2A, 2B, and then like a third-ish line that's actually your fourth would be really nice to soften up some of those matchups and distribute the ice time relatively evenly. And Namestnikov as your 4C would really do that. Or, maybe as a fourth line wing. If you ask him to play above that role, I do feel like you're setting yourself up for some disappointment. It's not that he can't, but I just feel like, for what the Jets want out of this group and what they have asked him to do, it's been too much responsibility. I think back to Perfetti really needing a skilled center to make the most of his passes and his offensive creativity. And like Vlad's just not that guy. He's a hardworking two-way forward, and he does great work there. But if you're asking him to be like this dynamo that just creates constant offense and really looks to be, a lead attack player, I feel like you're just not really getting what his game is at this stage. And, he's like, 32, 33 now. So as he slows down and his body starts to show some of that wear and tear from the style of game he plays, I just feel like the Jets need to be a little more cautious with what they ask of him. Again, I think as a tertiary supporting player, he is awesome. And he's been one of the better depth acquisitions the Jets have made over the past couple of years, which is why committing some term and money to him really wasn't a big deal to me. Obviously, you sort of have to pick and choose how many of these players you re-sign, but Namestnikov, I think, was a very sensible choice and somebody that, has really proven to be a steadfast member of this club. He has said repeatedly that he really likes playing in Winnipeg, and that kind of stuff really goes a long way, not only with the fan base, but with the team. Hearing somebody actively advocate for sticking around with the Jets, is really positive. It's not something that you hear from a ton of free agents, or at least you didn't until the past couple of seasons. And so him being one of these guys that sticks around, I think is a nice little ambassador thing, right? He has played for a ton of teams over the years, coming from super winning organizations like Tampa. He's played with the Rangers for a bit, even had a spell with Colorado, Detroit, and Dallas. And so getting to have Namestnikov in your bottom six really is a nice luxury. He's got a huge winning pedigree. He's been a great player throughout most of his career. And if the Jets kind of give him that third or fourth line role that I think would really suit him, I think it would really start to change some of the perception about what his ability is. Because in those roles, that's where I think he really shines. Let him feast on those softer minutes. Let him be your matchup god in your bottom six. And I think you're going to see a very different version of Namestnikov. Yeah, you'll see a points reduction, but I would much rather have him eating those matchups alive and beating up on like other third and fourth lines rather than forcing him into the 2C role and asking him to be something that's just outside of his usual scope of work. It's not that you can't do it, but it's really not an ideal fit. And I think this past season, we really saw the limitations of just how far you can push him as your 2C. But on that fourth line, man, he will absolutely wreck in whatever position he plays. So I'm kind of optimistic about his season. I think he will see a big reduction in points if he's played in that bottom six, but I don't care about that. I'd rather have somebody who can keep up with the thought process of like a Cole Perfetti or an Nyquist or something, and let Namestnikov be who he is in your bottom six. Let him be a wrecking ball. The guy already took a ton of abuse this past season anyways, and so kind of protecting his health might not be the worst thing. That dude, like, he threw himself in front of every single puck. He constantly got the crap beat out of him from like tons of rough hits and flying pucks. I mean, that guy was just like a magnet for injuries, and yet he really didn't miss many games at all. Just 4 games missed in the past year, and then the same for the previous season. So I don't know what this dude is made out of. I don't know if he's got adamantium in his bones or something, but this guy is extremely rugged, and it's nice to see him kind of thrive with the Jets. We don't often get too many of these guys coming in and really hitting it off immediately, but Namestnikov slid in, immediately became something of a fan favorite. And, for the past couple of seasons, he's really been a fun player to watch. And I'm sure as his, role changes and he starts to move further down the lineup, he'll continue to be that ever reliable, ever steady, metronomic sort of player. He doesn't really have as much competition in my mind, and I don't really think any of the new arrivals will threaten his position. Like Tanner Pearson, I know brings also Stanley Cup winning pedigree and is certainly a very solid player, but like between him and Vlad, I'd much rather take Vlad. Namestnikov is defensively still a good positive impact. He still does some really good two-way work, and Pearson, while he does finish opportunities very nicely, he's kind of on the washed side. And like Namestnikov, I think, is around the same age, and yet Vlad's ability to impact the game is a lot more pronounced, and I just feel like he's more likely to be a more successful two-way presence. So if I have a choice between him or Pearson or Koepke, 100% taking Vlad, zero question, and I would hope the Jets see it that way too. Maybe there's a surprise, though, and I can understand if the Jets have to make a guy like Scheifele happy with a Pearson appearance, but Namestnikov, for me, should be a lock for your bottom six one way or another. Curious to know if you feel that way as well. Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Speaking of guys who are, in my mind, locks for the bottom six, there's one other player that I think really shouldn't be pulled out of this lineup, and it is Alex Iafallo, yet another recent acquisition, and a guy who has, in my mind, really grown to be a bit of a fan favorite in the Jets fandom. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us as we're just chatting about some season predictions for Jets forwards over the past couple of days. We are closing out this series with the fourth line, and the fourth line has maybe some of the most opportunity for changes from the new arrivals, competition, injuries, you name it. The fourth line could be a real rotating cast. But just like Namestnikov, there's one other guy that I think should really be a lock for this bottom six. It's Alex Iafallo. Now, Iafallo is a really interesting player because when he first joined the Jets, I thought that he was going to be a lot like his prime Kings days, where he was very pesky, a very intriguing sort of face-off slot menace. Iafallo has always been really creative around those circles, and has got a great shot. I think his instincts tend to be very good when it comes to opportunistic moments, and he can kind of score some really greasy goals. He's not afraid to get it, mix it up in that blue paint area. He'll have really good hand-eye coordination, and the first season with the Jets was good. I don't think it was nearly as good as I was expecting. 27 points in 82 games, decent, but not great for somebody playing like 15 to 16 minutes a night. Now, usually when you see a decline in ice time for a player, usually that means their goal scoring and production actually goes down. But with Namestnikov, he actually scored more points this season than he did in the previous one. 31 points, 15 goals, 16 assists, playing 13 and a half-ish minutes. And that actually is pretty cool. It actually earned him a nice little contract extension for a couple seasons. And Iafallo has really talked again about, liking his time in Winnipeg, enjoying playing here. And to get that from a guy who's been in LA for most of his career is really cool. He's a Cali guy. And so I thought Iafallo might want to go back towards the coast and maybe hang out there a little bit. Yeah, obviously he has played in Minnesota before with, his college season. So maybe the Winnipeg jump really wasn't as big of a deal as it would ordinarily be. But Iafallo kind of coming in with the Velarde trade, a lot of people looked at him as a guy who was sort of a cast off, a bit of a toss in, and I was excited about him. And this past season, I think, really showed why. My favorite moment from this past year with him was when he actually went up to the CSI line and just really changed it. The top line without Velarde, you thought might take a bit of a step back, but Iafallo stepped in and actually gave them a lot of defensive stability that the trio had been missing. Iafallo doesn't always have like the craziest offensive play driving ability, but in terms of that two-way presence, the forechecking, and the defensive attention to detail, it really helped balance out Scheifele and Connor. And I was upset in some ways that they broke it up in the playoffs. Again, Iafallo is not necessarily your ideal top-line player, but I think he does enough right with the right line mates to where he brings some really good middle six to top six value. Again, you're not necessarily looking at it from the ideal arrangement, but when you have the Jets arranged that the way that they are, needing to kind of spread out their talent a little more without sacrificing punch, I think Iafallo actually worked quite well with Scheifele and Connor in his more recent stints. Originally, it didn't look that great, but this past season under Arniel, very different story. Iafallo was a real force. I thought that he fit nicely in there, and even if they weren't necessarily adding a lot of offensive production with that group, if nothing else, they were at least hemming opponents in and generally being a really big nuisance on the forecheck, which Iafallo does quite nicely. It's one of his best attributes, and I'm really glad that he's decided to stick around. I, at first, was kind of hesitant about keeping him just because I felt like he brought a fair bit of defensive value, but I kind of thought that the Jets maybe overused him a little bit, over-relied upon him, and instead that's kind of come full circle to be a really positive thing. All with, more alignments in how he's deployed, where he gets deployed, and what his role is, and he's really taken off as a great middle six option and somebody with quite a bit of versatility. So glad he's sticking around. He's been a great addition. It's interesting to see that the Kings didn't really think that he was valuable enough to retain. They put all of this stuff in this package for Dubois, and Dubois lasted one whole year with the Kings, man. Can you believe that? One season, and already, the Jets made out like bandits. So what a fun player he's been. I don't really feel like he should have competition from Pearson, but I'm sure he will. For me, Iafallo and Namestnikov are both better than Koepke and Pearson. Like, they just bring so much more. Their presence and veteran experience is great. Namestnikov has won titles. Sure, Iafallo hasn't, but he's just a really good two-way player and somebody whose versatility and skill allows him to fill in when somebody gets hurt up top. That, I think, is a really big deal and adds a lot of value to him as a player. And so I would really prefer him to stick around. I think he really shouldn't be coming out of the lineup for, some of these new additions. The only thing that I kind of worry about is because you have so many veterans signed and the Jets don't really bury salary, that rather than having competition for these spots, they just get all added into the lineup and take away any opportunities for the youth. I think that's my bigger fear, and it's probably something that the Jets are factoring into this upcoming season. I think they probably will go very veteran heavy, and so I wonder if even Chibrikov will really have a spot. I think I've already mapped him out as being a starter for this team, at least at the beginning of the season. But it wouldn't shock me if the Jets end up putting him more as like a 13th forward type. And like, I get it, right? Like, the Jets had a really big season. They won the President's Trophy. They did it going with all the veterans, and maybe they think that they can do it again. But I think given the changes to this roster composition, the loss of Ehlers, the promotion of some guys who are going to be slower and older, and the need to find more offense basically across the board, um, I would rather have the kids getting some real chances to make this team and to try and improve internally, because we all kind of know what the veterans are likely to do again. I doubt that they're going to repeat the President's Trophy, but this will still be a pretty competent regular season team. I just don't think that they're really built for the playoffs with what they have already. So if they can, make sure that they don't bench the wrong guys and don't put too many veterans in while leaving some, room for the youth to grow, I think that would be the most beneficial outcome, hopefully, for this season and really beyond. We got to start preparing for the next core to turn over. I think that group is going to be a lot of fun. I think that there's going to be more skill across the board than we've ever seen. And guys like Iafallo and Namestnikov can kind of help bridge that gap and welcome in this new generation. But would be curious to know how you feel about it. Do you want Pearson to start over guys like Iafallo and Vlad? Do you think that the Jets are planning to have these guys for the full season, or do you think maybe Winnipeg ends up shipping somebody out at some point? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, that's all the time that we have, though. I thank you so much for listening to this series and really appreciate you sticking around. Next week, if the Jets have any major moves, we will react to them earlier in the week. I'll be back after the first day or so. So we will be shifting to a 3-episode-a-week format. Just be prepared for that. Likely have an episode out on Tuesday or Wednesday, probably Tuesday, especially if Winnipeg announces some major contract extensions. But like I said, that's all the time that we have for tonight. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.